Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
Dr. Schieren is the Dean of the Department of Education of Alanus University since 2008. He received his PhD in philosophy at the University of Essen in Germany.
Yeah, dear audience in the room and in the Zoom room, dear Dan, thank you so much for organizing that conference and having me here. So my topic will be addressing the question of ideology around Waldorf education. Waldorf education is one of the world's most successful models of progressive education. However, it is controversial and more finds itself in a position of having to justify itself. It is increasingly coming under criticism. The criticism is directed at its theoretical foundation at anthroposophy. Waldorf education is said to be ideologically influenced by it and is therefore considered to be esoteric, eccentric, and unscientific. In this talk, the existing accusations of ideology against Waldorf education should be considered in terms of their own ideology. The question to be examined here is, what view of the world and humanity and what understanding of science is the yardstick by which Waldorf education is measured and critically assessed? The topic will be examined with regard to three different categories, which can be described as the concept of the self, the concept of personality, the external world, and the internal world. And I start with the concept of personality. What is the human self? There are different concepts of the self and theories of personality within philosophy and psychology. A more idealistic approach assumes that the human ego is free and an unconditional entity. This goes back to Aristotle and also to Fichte. Contemporary philosophy and psychology have largely distanced themselves from these idealistic positions. On the one hand, there is the tabula rasa theory, which states that humans are born without any characteristics at all. According to this understanding, an individuality only develops within the framework of a complex socialization process through the influences of society. A more genetic biological position, which became popular at the end of the last century with the discovery of DNA, assumes that humans are essentially determined by their genetic makeup. However, it has not yet been possible to pinpoint central human characteristics such as intelligence, morality, musicality, or creativity solely on the basis of genes. Since the 21st century, brain research has gained importance in the question of what a human personality is. The promise is that once the black box, the human brain, has been explored, the mystery of the self can be solved. However, a human personality is currently conceived. It is usually interpreted as being determined by external factors, either by genes, socialization experiences, or brain processes. The recognition of an individuality based solely on itself and drawing from itself is hardly represented. Therefore, with regard to current concept of a personality, it is appropriate to speak of gradual external determination or determinism. Humans are considered to be more or less externally determined beings. How about the outside world? What is the currently prevailing ideological perspective on the outside world? The modern scientific worldview and the philosophical positivism that developed in the 19th and 20th centuries are based on a reductionist understanding that all phenomena in the world have a material cause. This naturally applies to the world of physics, which is why we also speak of physicalism here. But it also applies to the living world, assuming that all life processes have a material cause. Similarly, psychological and mental phenomena are thought to have material causes too. And based on brain research, there is a rather unreflected assumption that the brain is the cause of thought and consciousness. Accordingly, physical, biological, psychological, and mental phenomena are understood as epiphenomena of material effects. This is a scientific paradigm that has been prevalent since the 19th century and is referred to as reductionism or materialism. Now I come to the inner world. This inner world encompasses all phenomena of consciousness, human perception, thinking, judgment, ideas, fantasies, memories, and dreams, as well as psychological and emotional phenomena. It is any content of consciousness that can be experienced and observed by the human subject. How is this inner world thought about in the present day? With the dawn of the modern era, René Descartes distinguished between res extensa and res cogitans, thereby proclaiming a duality of the external and internal worlds. Immanuel Kant later emphasized in his critical philosophy that human cognition produces concepts and ideas that do not reach the essence of the external world, which he calls thing in itself. Therefore, the inner world is fundamentally separated from the outer world. Reality exists only in the imagination of the subject and is therefore subjective. In contemporary philosophy, this position is continued with constructivism. It states that concepts and ideas that people form about the world are only names and do not capture the essence of a thing. In medieval philosophy, the term nominalism was coined for this. So, determinism, materialism, nominalism are the basic assumptions of our time against which criticism of Waldorf education is formulated. So what about Waldorf education? How ideological is it really? And now I go through it again and ask about what is the concept of the self out of the perspective of Waldorf education? How does Waldorf education view the human being? Based on Rudolf Steiner's ideas, one can have the conviction that every human being is free and carries an intellectual core that continues to develop in ever new incarnations under the conditions of our karma. As clear as Steiner's view of a human individuality is in this direction, it is now interesting to note that he was very cautious in his use of the concepts of reincarnation and karma in relation to Waldorf education. In the many educational lectures on the foundation of Waldorf education between 1919 and 1925, he only very occasionally refers to reincarnation and karma from an educational point of view. Steiner did not want to establish a reincarnation and karma pedagogy. That would be intrusive in a fatal sense and totally ideology-laden. This is not the aim of Waldorf education. Waldorf education does not simply replace determinism by freedom. This would also be unrealistic because if a free individual personality already existed, there would be no need for further education and therefore no need for pedagogy. The development of a free personality is not the starting point, but rather in the sense of Waldorf education, a goal of education. In this sense, Waldorf education merely operates on the assumption that the development of an individual and free personality is possible in the course of a person's life. Interestingly, the actual existence or non-existence of a human self cannot be proven. There is no proof of the self. This would probably be a similarly complex task as the many proofs of God's existence attempted in philosophy and theology. However, It is another matter entirely whether a pedagogy is based on the assumption that every child has an individual core essence within them that is gifted with freedom or not. Waldorf education does this. Its didactics addresses the human ego capable of freedom and attempt to support the development of freedom. Such an individuality-oriented and individuality-promoting view of children and young people is, of course, not limited to Waldorf education. Many progressive educational approaches and many people working in various educational institutions share this perspective and base their educational ideals on it. This is a great source of developmental power and resilience. The subjective experience of a human encounter shows that when we feel seen and understood by another person, we open up and gain self-confidence. In psychology, this is called mattering. Conversely, when we feel unseen and misjudged, we tend to close ourselves off. This applies to adults and even more so to children. And the assumption of a free and self-determined self is not an ideology, as it is not an absolute proposition. Rather, it creates a space and framework of possibilities for education. In this context, this developing self is not set in stone. It does not rule out the possibility that social influences and complex socialization processes are of great importance. From this perspective, the human self does not develop in a solipsistic way, but rather, we heard about that by Constanza today, but rather in, with, and through a social community. From an educational perspective, it is interesting to look at how differently pedagogy proceeds when it works on the assumption of an autonomous human self, or when it does not. It makes an essential difference. However, for reasons of time, thank you, we will refrain from going into further detail here. I will only list some pedagogical aspects which support within Waldorf education the development of the human self. First, no selection through grading, no subject hierarchies. It is talent-oriented. The curriculum is appropriate to the development, and it is community-oriented. Now I have a look at the outside world from the perspective of Waldorf. If the current view of the outside world is shaped by materialism, we must ask, how does the Waldorf School view it? Given that the worldview of anthroposophy has spiritual connotations, one might assume that the Waldorf School response to contemporary materialism is spiritualism. If this were the case, then Waldorf schools would simply be replacing one existing ideology with another. They would indeed be ideological, as critics claim. However, when founding Waldorf education, Rudolf Steiner insisted that anthroposophical contents should have no place in the classroom. He did not want to establish an anthroposophic school. In this respect, Waldorf schools cannot and must not simply replace a materialistic worldview with a spiritualistic one. On the other hand, it is just as problematic when ideologically biased materialistic models of the world are uncritically presented as teaching and learning content. How do Waldorf schools address this dilemma? The outside world appear in the classroom by school subjects. As it is a decisive methodological and didactic principle of Waldorf schools, Waldorf education, that the way in which teaching contents and thus world contents appear in the classroom. It is always experience, sensory, and action-oriented. It is, from my view, a mantra of Waldorf education that everything that children learn, they should experience and they should do it themselves. This is the didactic principle of Waldorf education. It is not just about the what of the learning content, but above all, the how of the learning. The entire learning process is an open, unfinished, and highly dynamic process that does not involve fixed principles of word explanation. which are always only provisional anyway. The aim is for children and young people to be able to connect as intensively and holistically as possible with the learning content. In summary, it can be said that Waldorf education's response to reductionist materialism is not spiritualism, but phenomenology. And this is not an ideology, but a method inspired by Goethe. The last aspect, the inner world. The final aspect to consider is the inner world. How does Waldorf education deals with nominalism? In his philosophy, Rudolf Steiner took the currently unpopular side of realism or essentialism. And attributed to thinking the ability to grasp the essence of things. Constructivism, on the other hand, assumes that human cognition only has subjective perspectives on reality. A concept of truth that is still common in idealistic philosophy is therefore highly controversial at present. For if there are only subjective perspectives, then there can be no universal truth. This position, which exists not only in philosophy, but also in society as a whole, as a more or less conscious cultural agreement, is also linked to historical experiences. Karl Popper has had a decisive influence on this discussion. In his philosophy, he opposes essentialism. In his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, he argues, based on the experience of National Socialism, that historically speaking, the concept and claim to truth must necessarily lead to conflicts. Based on the premise of the existence of truth and based on the premise of the existence of truth, any deviating position is erroneous. Popper demands that we distance ourselves from the concept of truth, from the concept of essential thinking. How do anthroposophy and Waldorf education relate to this? Of course, Rudolf Steiner was an essentialistic, idealistic thinker, and with his anthroposophy, he presented a universalist metaphysical model for explaining the world. However, he wanted to be measured by the principles of rationality as an expression of humanity. In his ideal, anthroposophy was not a doctrine, not a dogma, but a modern, open project of knowledge intended as an instrument to break down ideological boundaries rather than generate new ideological traps. As such, the project of anthroposophy is a path of knowledge, a training in knowledge, and a methodological orientation. One can say anthroposophy is not a house to live in, but rather a street to walk along, or even better, a farm ground to work on. Thus, anthroposophy, as it was originally intended, should not appear as a content in Waldorf schools, but only as a method. But nevertheless, the children should find a solid ground for establishing their own individual worldview. The following aspects are crucial for it. Trust in thinking, values, and something meaningful, and ideals. With regard to the tension between nominalism and essentialism, it can be said that Waldorf education does not respond to the nominalistic orientation of contemporary culture with essentialism. Popper is right in his skepticism and criticism of essentialism. It can no longer be a question of fixed essential truths. That was not Rudolf Steiner's concern with anthroposophy either. Rather, it is about generating individual perspectives on the search for meaning and the discovery of something which is meaningful and significant. In this understanding, also at Waldorf schools, it is not a question of a universal essentialism, but of an individual perspective on essentialism. In summary, it can be said that the presented ideological critique of Waldorf education does not sufficiently critically reflect on its own ideological bias. It states that Waldorf education is an ideology, whereas anthroposophy, based on epistemology, critically distances itself from every ideology. Thank you so much.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, Preston Fellows of Harvard College.